Hey, everybody, welcome into Purple Insider. Matthew Coller, along with Dane Mizutani of the Pioneer Press, as we continue our series called What Happened to That Guy, where we look at Minnesota Vikings players whose expectations were maybe not met for this season. And we're going to talk about Josh Dobbs in this episode. And Dane, Josh Dobbs is a fascinating subject because he arrived in Minnesota after Kirk Cousins tore his Achilles and became just a revolution for the Vikings for 2 weeks, where he came into a game and beat Atlanta while barely knowing the offense, and then was absolutely fantastic in the first half against New Orleans that ultimately led to a win. And in Denver, Josh Dobbs played well enough to win the game. They gave it away at the end, and the wheels thereafter came off on Josh Dobbs mania. So, in your opinion, what happened? Why did Josh Dobbs have so much success to start as a Viking and then so quickly that disappeared?
In Space Jam when the Monstars just steal the talent, like that's what it felt like happened with Josh Dobbs because he was so good for, we'll call it 2 games. It was really a game and a half because the second half of that Saints game was by and large pretty underwhelming. But for 2 games, Josh Dobbs literally was the best player on the field for the Vikings. Like, could do no wrong, came in, led them to an incredible win over Atlanta. I'll never forget that moment in the press box at Mercedes-Benz Superdome when Josh Dobbs finds Brandon Powell at the goal line late in the game, throws a game-winning touchdown pass, and we're sitting like in the press box, and Kwesi and his staff are behind in like a little riser above. They're not in their own booth at road stadiums, and they just go nuts because I think all of them were like watching it happen in real time. Like, holy crap, this might work. And then you see what he did against New Orleans the next week, where they look like a dynamic offense. Tricks me into thinking like, wow, they might be someone that could be scary moving forward, even without Kirk Cousins. And then I think what we kind of saw happen, I joke about the Monstar stealing his talent, but teams started to heat him up on the blitz. He gets through his progressions pretty slow. He's not very accurate when, especially under pressure, he's not very accurate. And it just kind of seemed to go by the wayside after that. I think it could have worked with Dobbs, considering the alternatives, considering Nick Mullins, who threw for 400 yards twice, basically, but threw a million interceptions along the way. And rookie Jaron Hall, who was clearly not ready for the NFL. I think Dobbs could have been the best option if Kevin O'Connell was more malleable, but it was pretty clear that he had a way that the position had to kind of be run, and Dobbs could not do that. I think the more he learned the offense, the less effective he was, which seems so backwards. But it really started to play out as the Denver game. He had a cool play, but after getting that pitch from TJ Hawkinson and getting his bell rung, I don't think he was ever the same. Maybe that's part of it. And then to throw 4 picks against Chicago, come back after the bye and not put up any points against Vegas. He lost all his magic. I think part of what made him so magical early on was he was unpredictable. You didn't know what was going to happen. Defenses didn't really have time to plan for a guy like that. Once they realized what they could take away, he didn't really have anything else to kind of fall back on. So kind of a calamity of things that run together. I think if Kevin O'Connell was more malleable to Josh Dobbs, there was probably a little bit more to unlock in him. But I also get there's 10 other guys on the field. You can't change everything for one guy who you traded basically a late round pick swap for. You can't change your whole offense for that. But yeah, it just, I've never really experienced something be so high and then go back to so low. I know you covered Buffalo backup quarterbacks a lot, so you probably have. But that was a new experience for me with Josh Dobbs.
Mostly the Buffalo backup quarterbacks were low, but the one thing that you did see from someone like Ryan Fitzpatrick was he would have incredibly hot stretches and then throw a bunch of interceptions or struggle. Dobbs wasn't exactly the same type of player, but I think across sports this happens a lot where somebody gets called up from the G League and makes a bunch of threes in a game, and you go, whoa, we've really got something here. And then that player cools off. The Linsanity will always go down in history as kind of a lesson, but this happens to home run hitters in baseball where you get hot for a month and then everyone thinks you're a star. And then it's really about sustaining it and being able to adjust when defenses adjust to you. And I think that was a major issue, was that there were weaknesses in his game that were covered up by a couple of really incredible plays on the move. And by New Orleans not being prepared for their scheme and finding some wide open wide receivers, but even at the goal line where he's got a pass into the end zone, but doesn't really see it and then makes an incredible run, his athleticism covered up for some of the shortcomings, and some are his fault and some are not, like not knowing the offense when he just showed up. But eventually that was going to matter. These NFL teams start working on the offense in OTAs for a reason. If everybody could just show up at the ballpark and play, then they would. They wouldn't put their bodies through and all the time into learning the offense. So that was a major part of it for Josh Dobbs, is that teams forced him to stay in the pocket. I think another part of it was that against the Chicago Bears and the Las Vegas Raiders, he faced two defenses that were really emerging at that moment. That Chicago's defense early in the year was pretty mediocre, but then when they got Montez Sweat, it completely changed the dynamic of that defense. Not only that, but he was dominated, Dobbs was, in that game, by the PFF #1 cornerback in the entire NFL, Jalen Johnson, who had an incredible game. And sometimes we live on the razor's edge in football where a throw gets tipped up in the air and hits the ground and no one ever remembers it, or it gets tipped up in the air and intercepted and it changes the entire way you view someone. And I think that happened a couple of times in his 4 interception game, but he was playing against a great defense. And as you mentioned, they didn't pare it down for him. They wanted to give him the whole offense. And I remember Wes Phillips and Kevin O'Connell both saying, if we don't give him the whole offense, then he's not going to be able to find those wide open wide receivers. And I think there's probably a middle ground there. You can't make it a high school offense, but you also can't make it Kirk Cousins. And then we saw Las Vegas just dominate Patrick Mahomes a couple of weeks later. And you had to think that Josh Dobbs wondered, well, hey, why were they so hard on me when that defense was actually good? And then I thought it was a little bit odd that they decided to make him QB3 and elevate Jaron Hall to the backup. So you could see how important it was to Kevin O'Connell that he knew the offense. But I think when it comes to Dobbs, it's just sort of a tale as old as time of a player who has enough physical talent. He was a 4th-round draft pick. He's been around the league to have his moments. But what makes really good quarterbacks good is that week after week after week, they're consistent. And even when he was in Arizona, this guy beat the Dallas Cowboys and threw for 9 yards per pass attempt in a game against one of the best teams in the NFL. And then a couple of weeks later, threw a couple of interceptions and, lost to, mediocre teams. So I think that's just kind of who Josh Dobbs is. He is an effective backup quarterback when used minimally, but if you're going to rely that much on the run and you aren't as sharp of an accurate passer, it's going to be difficult to sustain. But how many wins do you think that they would have had they just played Josh Dobbs the whole way and hoped that the roller coaster swung back up at some point?
See, I was going to go the opposite way. Like, I don't know how they probably don't win many more games than they finish with, because they finish with 7 wins. And I think I think of the Nick Mullins game against the Bengals, where he was pretty good for a while and then he imploded down the stretch. I don't know if they're at their highest of highs, which they were at times in against the Bengals, with Josh Dobbs running the show, judging off what we saw when it really started to go downhill. So I think maybe 7 is still about the same. I think they probably still are in danger of losing those 5 of 6 down the stretch, because I think defenses did continue to figure them out. But if you take away the Atlanta game, which the Vikings had no business winning, and if you take away the New Orleans game, which I know we can't just do that because they happened, but I'm only doing this for a thought exercise. They would have the 5th pick in the draft right now. If you go from 7-10 to 5-12, and I guess there might have been some changing with the strength of schedule because the margins with the Chargers might change based on liked opponents. But right now, looking at Tankathon, if you just go from 7-10 to 5-12, you have a worse strength of schedule than the Chargers. You would be the 5th pick in the draft. So Are we going to look back on Josh Dobbs as, oh, that was a fun story for that guy who had 2 games that was cool to rally behind for a little bit? Or are we going to look back on Josh Dobbs as, shit, they could have had a top 5 pick? So I don't know.
Well, I think depends on your perspective. Sometimes, the moments and memories last forever, but the impact of not having the higher draft pick, we'll find out what that ultimately ends up meaning. Whether it's a Vikings trade up, whether it's an edge rusher they take, whether they trade down and still pick a quarterback, but it will be impacted significantly by these two very random, absolutely out of nowhere games by Josh Dobbs. And yeah, we definitely will never forget them. And hopefully, you don't forget to watch the other parts of this series either. What happened to that guy? We have looked at several other players, including Marcus Davenport and Alexander Madison, and plan to look on the 2022 draft class as well. Matthew Coller, Dane Mizutani. We'll catch you next time.